On January 8th, 2022, the Wall Street Journal shared a post on X speaking about Apple's dominance over the iMessage. This tweet came at a time when multiple articles were complaining about the bullying students were getting from the green bubble in the iMessage. Android later decided to retweet this post, inviting Apple to work together to solve this problem, only to find out that Android itself got bullied in the comments. This is the story of how the broke Android stereotype began, and what roles did Google, Samsung, and Apple played in the making of this image. Android's history isn't as long as Samsung or Apple. In fact, Android's real start after the 2003 launch and the 2005 Google acquisition was in 2008, with the HTC Dream. And like many of us, Android's beginnings were a bit humble. First of all, Android is a free open source system, meaning that anyone in the world can install it from Android's website and run it on their devices. That's why the years after, Android was able to convince bigger companies to switch to it. Samsung with the GTI 7500, Huawei with T-Mobile Pulse, Sony with Xperia X10, Google with the Pixel, Microsoft with Surface Duo, and lately, nothing with nothing. Of course, most brands mentioned here are big companies, but that doesn't mean they are the only ones. Because as we said before, Android is a free open source system for everyone, meaning that any phone brand can now assemble their phone in China, load it with Android, and flood the market with it. And that was Google's biggest mistake. Letting anyone in. Actually, Google never felt the pain and impact from this problem, because the more phone companies adopt Android, the more money Google makes, through licensing its services to phones companies, collecting royalties, and gathering users' data. Everything went that way, until the whole market became dominated with just two operating systems. The biggest losers from this policy were the larger companies, especially Samsung, not in profit, but in image and reputation. In fact, Samsung had its own operating system in the past, Bada, but abandoned it for Android. On one hand, Bada was poorly branded and never gained enough developer support, which caused a lack of apps in Samsung's App Store. The switch to Android was the best option for Samsung at that time, because it was free, ready-made, and Google handled most of the work, like updates and security. This allowed Samsung to focus on creating the best hardware, while the software was on Google. But here where the problems begins.
If you had to pick one phone for the rest of your life to take photos with, would it be an iPhone? Would it be an Android?
Yeah, it would be the iPhone.
So, if I asked you the same question, would you choose an Android or an iPhone? And before you answer that, we need to understand something first. The question here is not which phone has the best quality, because both phones have one of the best specs when it comes to cameras. Samsung even excels in some aspects. The real question here is about optimization. If we look at Apple as an example, we will find that all of their models use the same operating system, the iOS, which gives Apple a significant advantage in optimizing all phone components to one operating system. This also applies to app developers, who only have to work on one platform, with the same hardware type and a strict design requirements. That's why apps like Snapchat and Instagram look crisp on iPhones, and like Minecraft on Android. Because unlike iOS, when developers work on an app for Android, they have thousands of models with different screen sizes to optimize for, each with different Android versions, camera hardware, and each with different chipsets. Of course, this ununified control gives developers more flexibility and freedom compared with the iOS, but also comes with higher development complexity. Once you understand this point, you start realizing that the US sanctions against Huawei in 2019, which forced Google to cut ties with the company, were actually a blessing for Huawei, because in that same year, Huawei released its own operating system, HarmonyOS. While it still accounts for only 1% of the OS market, but at least gave Huawei the chance to fully control all aspects of its devices. And that's the same path many fans believe Samsung should take. However, that's not only a hard decision for Samsung to take, but insanely impossible. On the positive side, it will distance Samsung from most crappy Androids in market, help rebrand Samsung's image, and make Samsung's phones more efficient and secure. But the idea would be also a disaster in terms of business and a nightmare for developers. Because Android is already working, and Samsung already tried, twice, but failed. Developers also on the other side won't agree to switch, so we probably won't see that split anytime soon. And that's exactly where the last key player steps in: Apple. Wait, still not subscribed? Come on, bro. All you have to do is follow the damn train! Like and subscribe. In 2007, Alan Eustace, one of Google's top engineers, received an unexpected call from Apple's CEO, Steve Jobs. Back at that time, Apple was working with Google to integrate its services in the iPhone before its big release. Now, knowing Steve Jobs, what do you think that call was about? Privacy issues? Legal concerns? Ad revenue? Or design standards? Well, the reason for that call was that Steve Jobs has noticed that the second O in the Google logo wasn't the right shade of yellow. From this incident, you can understand that Jobs was very obsessed with visual details, and that was reflected clearly on Apple's early releases, resulting in the famous quote, "Only Apple could make Apple things." Apple under Jobs would prefer to postpone or even cancel a release if it wasn't perfect. And that was the base for iPad and iPhone's luxury marketing. Android, on the other hand, chose evolution over perfection. Most early Android versions didn't care much about design, but focused more on adding features, experimenting, and giving users more control. Unlike iOS, which was visually appealing, but closed, lacking features, and very restricted. Of course, this problem is no longer a debate. The latest Android versions are no less than impressive. Take Oppo as an example.
The Settings app, the Dynamic Island, split notifications, lock screen customization, quick settings, camera app layout, AirDrop straight from an Oppo to an iPhone.
Of course, we can't end this video without mentioning the iMessage, which is the breaking point in Apple's effort to push the broke Android stereotype. Actually, this case was mostly solved in 2024, due to pressure from the EU and customers. Before that, Apple was specifically targeting Android users. When an iPhone user texts another iPhone user, they can both see blue bubbles, read receipts, see typing indicators, can add reactions, and upload high-quality images. On Android, Apple completely killed this experience before 2024. Now, most of it is fixed, but Apple still marks you with a green bubble. When Tim Cook was asked about this, his answer was simple.
I can't send my mom certain videos, or she can't send me certain videos, and so we leave
Buy your mom an iPhone.
My final message to anyone that still believes Android is broke:
breathe